Our second item is a discussion regarding educational institutions in the Central Business District. Mr. Belknap, I will mention, because I know there are some people in the room who would like to discuss this, I think it is prudent to have this discussion in front of the entire council so that the discussion can be with the entire council. So if you would bear with me, we'll wait another week and then we will have public comment with that. So, Mr. Belknap, that being said, hit us, man.
Good afternoon. Well, hopefully I won't hit you too hard, but I think my goal was to maybe provide a little bit of history about zoning in the Central Business District and allowable uses, and then talk about how education institutions came to be and what occurred in 2005, applications we've seen since that point, and kind of maybe some suggestions about how the council might be able to gather more information on the topic in order to inform policy development moving forward. So as I mentioned, on the 21st of May, we had a fairly large code amendment that came before the council. It was really not changing a lot of the code, but it was changing its structure. And it was moving it from more of a narrative format into a tabular format for ease of use and consistency and compatibility. During that discussion, there were some questions that were raised about the allowance of educational institutions downtown. And in that process, the council ultimately did approve the code amendment as it existed, which really largely focused and continued to allow educational institutions in the Central Business District as a conditionally permitted use. But they also requested that we come back to the administrative committee, and I think Gary suggested we could come back to talk about the council and find out specifically if the council wishes to have the Planning and Zoning Commission review this topic, kind of specifically what they would like the commission to review, since they had gone through that process through the overall code amendment as well as the amendment that happened in 2005. As we step back to zoning, really the fundamental purpose of zoning was to restrict the use of private land and to segregate uses that were thought to be incompatible. And in the classical sense, it's the home next to the smelter or the rendering plant or the heavy industrial use. And that's really kind of the basis of the formation of zoning as we understand it today. Often residential and commercial uses are segregated and separated, but that has begun to change quite a bit recently over the course of really the last decade or last 20 years, that there has been an increasing focus of integrating land uses in order to provide services and create walkable communities and reduce vehicular trips through mixed-use development. But that's really the basis of zoning, dates back to the industrial age, or even before that, but the primary in the U.S. is related to heavy industrial uses. A general goal is to group compatible uses of similar intensities within the same zoning district. Incompatibility in land uses can often occur in a number of different ways, and usually it's related to some sort of impact that one use has that is damaging to another. And it could be noise or traffic or air emissions or hazardous materials or environmental impacts or vibrations or dust or maybe light pollution or hours of operation. There are a whole number of things related to a land use that could be impactful to other land uses in an area. And so the goal overall is to just group compatible uses that have similar operating characteristics, that utilize similar public resources and services in order to maintain that compatibility and to not adversely impact uses. There are a number of forms of zoning. Euclidean, which is really regulating by land use, which is largely what we have and is most common across the U.S. There are other forms that have developed over time, performance zoning, that really measures kind of impacts of the use. And so it's an impact based, sometimes it's a scorecard type system where different levels of impact are scored and determine whether a use is compatible within a zoning district or not. And then most recently we've seen form-based zoning that has really moved away from regulation of actually land use and what occurs in the structure, and focuses more on the form of the structure, its relationship to the public place, to the street, to the sidewalk, and really looks at the urban to the rural spectrum, the transect as they call it, from the urban center out to the rural edges, and really has much less focus on the regulation of the actual use that occurs in the structures, but more about the character of the buildings themselves. In most zoning districts, they allow, in Euclidean zoning, which is really largely what our code is, it identifies allowable uses, those that are called conditionally permitted uses, and then we have what we call bulk and dimensional standards. So that's how wide or how large does the lot need to be, how tall can built structures be, how far do they need to be away from adjacent property lines, and other development standards like off-street parking and other components. As I mentioned, our code is largely Euclidean with some form-based elements that appear in various locations. And again, regulations based on land use, not necessarily the tax status of an organization. Really, we're looking at the use itself. So if it's a professional office use and it's for a nonprofit organization, it's still a professional office use. We're just regulating the use, not necessarily its tax status. For the city of Moscow, we have a number of residential zones, and we also have a number of commercial zoning districts, ranging in the residential from ag forest up to multiple family residential R4, and on the commercial side from residential office all the way up to industrial and the urban mixed commercial zoning designation. So I thought I'd take a quick look at zoning as it has existed downtown over the history of the city. And the first zoning ordinance that I could find was from 1933. There was a commercial and business zone, and there was a residential zone. And those were really the two divisions of the city at that point in time. The commercial and business zone that encompassed most of the downtown area essentially allowed all uses, all commercial and all residential, and any other enterprise that was defined at that time. The next amendment, a substantial rewrite of the zoning code, was in 1957. The Central Business District was created at that point in time, and it allowed private schools conducted for gain was really the only use identified. So we had all other uses permitted in residential districts. We had stores and shops, banks, offices, studios, hotels, restaurants, tea rooms, cafes, and other places serving food and beverage, theaters, amusement houses, bowling alleys, dance halls, skating rinks. But the only thing that was really somewhat related to educational uses were the private schools conducted for gain. Then beginning in 1950, also in the 1957 amendment, we had in the R3 district, which was at that point in time our multiple family residential district, institutions for higher education was listed in the code. Now that use wasn't defined, but it is somewhat self-explanatory, but that was the first appearance of a specific reference to a college or university type use in the city code, in the city zoning code in 1957. And at that point in time, all of the university's campus was technically zoned multifamily residential. So that use did appear in that zoning district, but it was not defined. It included institutions for higher education, fraternity or sorority houses, and when related to a college or university. The next large code amendment was in 1971. Central business becomes community business, so they retitled the zoning district, and educational institution was first defined then in the 1971 code, and was not listed use within the business or community business district, what they called the BC district at that time. The next large code amendment was in 1981. The educational institution definition now disappears. So it appeared in the 1971 ordinance, and in 1981 that definition fell out of the definition section of the code. But what was created in 1981 was a university zoning district, and so that was the first appearance of the U-zone, and that use of educational institutions was named in the university zoning district. It just had fallen out of the definition section of the code.
I need to ask you a quick question. In this process, were conditional uses permitted? Was the process in place or not?
There were conditionally permitted uses, but educational institutions were not on that list.
Okay.
At that time.
Thank you.
The next large code amendment was in 1990. Again, it moved then from the business community to central business district. There were a list of a number of uses: vocational schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, governmental offices, and similar public or private institutions were allowed, excluding elementary and junior high schools at that time. And the educational institution definition then reappears in the definition section in 1990. And that's largely what we had in the code up until about 2005 at that point. Beginning in, I think, late 2004 and early 2005, there were two educational uses that were allowed within commercial zoning districts in the city. The first of which was New St. Andrews College in the Central Business District, and at that point in time, the zoning administrator had determined that he felt that it was a permitted use by right underneath the category of churches, synagogues, mosques, governmental offices, libraries, museums, art galleries, police and fire stations, and similar public or private institutions. So that was the land use category, and there is some language in the code that allows some flexibility to the zoning administrator where a use is not specifically named to interpret it, to look at similar and comparable uses. And that was the determination that was made at that point in time.